Greetings, truth seekers. Many people probably ask this question: how the ice wall in the Antarctic appeared, how and why it formed, and where did permafrost come from, and why the poles of cold are not on the poles themselves. This topic has been bothering me for quite some time, since the facts offered to us do not match the theories. This is why I decided to systematize the information to prove at least some of the offered versions as wrong. Let's list some of the facts about permafrost that are more or less true and checked many and many times. The depth of the frost can reach up to 900 meters. 1200 meters of frost is also encountered. The largest area of permafrost is located in Siberia. There are also areas in America. However, in southern hemisphere, except for the Antarctic, there are no permafrost zones. I don't count the highland regions as the Himalayas or the Andes, where parts of the earth are also frosted, but their origin is kind of clear and do not raise any questions. Permafrost is slowly melting, and the surface it covers is gradually declining, both in Siberia and in North America. There are a number of discoveries of animal corpses, frozen and now thawed. Some of the remains were preserved really well, and more than that, some of the mammoths discovered were with undigested food in their stomachs, and some of them even with grass in their mouths. Local peoples were using meat from the bodies of dead animals, including mammoths, that thawed, for food for themselves and for their dogs. And now let's look at the official reasons of permafrost development. It is said that this is the result of the so-called Ice Age. It is the period in time when temperatures on Earth fell to levels significantly lower than nowadays. For the Earth to freeze, yearly average temperature has to be below zero. The age of permafrost in certain areas of the Earth is estimated to be from 1 to 1.5 million years. It is said that the latest temperature decrease was about 10,000 years ago, and we are talking about millions of years. Why? Because there is such a term as thermal capacity and thermal conductivity. The heat of melting or crystallization of ice is 1.4 kilocalories per 1 mole. So it is different from other liquids. Thermal capacity is around a half a calorie to a gram degree. This means that ice is hard to melt and water is hard to freeze. This is an anomaly that is specific to ice and water, specific heat capacity. Even if you cool down the surface to an absolute zero instantly, most of the substance will not cool down throughout the whole volume. We looked at the table with the depth of the frost. It is stated that for the Earth to freeze 600 meters down, yearly average temperature has to be below zero for 775,000 years. This length of the Ice Age is in itself enough to cancel the official version, since there are no facts that confirm that there was such a long Ice Age. This story was probably created to explain permafrost this deep, at least to some extent. However, we have animal bodies that are not only preserved, but we have remains of food both in the stomachs and in the mouths of animals, which means that they were frozen very quickly. So this was not a slow temperature decline, when winter became longer and longer and summer shorter. If mammoths froze during winter frost, there is no way that the grass was still in their mouths. Another point is that these bodies, up to the point when they thawed, have no signs of corpse decomposition. This is the reason that meat from these bodies can be used for food. But this means that after freezing, these corpses never defrosted, or else in the first summer, no matter its length, these corpses would decompose, and this fact alone proves that freezing was catastrophic, and it is not connected to a cyclical temperature change due to the change of seasons. And the fact that their meat is suitable for eating means it did not spend tens of thousands of years in permafrost, as we are convinced. The catastrophe that froze the mammoths happened relatively recently, 300, maybe 500 years ago. The trick is that, when frozen, meat and other organic materials lose their properties and change anyway. The fact that microorganisms cannot develop in meat in low temperatures does not mean that protein molecules do not dissolve over time in low temperatures. What other options do we have? Proponents of the Cherenkov effect, which would cause either a full turn of the Earth or its shift from the initial position, state that the inertial wave that is caused by the turning of the Earth crust should have washed the so-called methane hydrates to the surface of the continents. These compounds are only stable under high pressure, which is only present deep in the oceans. But if they are raised to the surface, they actively start to dissolve into gas and water, actively absorbing heat. Without touching on the Cherenkov effect itself, let's look at the methane hydrate version of permafrost. If the wave was able to wash ashore such a great number of methane hydrates, which could cause a long-term permafrost at such a big territory, then where is the methane that was emitted during dissolution? Its percentage in the atmosphere has to be not just high, but extremely high. But in fact, it is very low, just several thousandths of a percent. Moreover, methane hydrates on the surface of continents and their dissolution does not explain frost that is deep down. This process had to be catastrophic, which means very fast and should have been over in several days. Ground could not have physically frozen to the depths that we see today in such a time. There are also doubts that methane hydrates could be moved to the middle of the continent so far away, since methane hydrates start dissolving not when they're on land or on the surface, but when external pressure starts to decrease. It means that they would have to start dissolving in the ocean, in the top layers of water. This way, water with methane hydrates should have frozen close to the shore in shallow waters, and it would have happened before methane hydrates were washed ashore and deep into the continent. As a result, we would have to see ice walls along the shores of the ocean, but not permafrost deep in Siberia. And where do we have ice walls kilometers tall? It's in Greenland and in the Antarctic. The ice is 3 kilometers thick in Greenland and up to 4 kilometers in the Antarctic. These are the real walls, but we have information that around 15th century in Greenland there was life, that cities existed, trade flourished. This is why it was called Greenland. It had pleasant climate and suited people well. But in 16th century, it is described as dead land, buried under a thick layer of ice, and that it's impossible to dock the shores. We can suppose that the Antarctic froze at roughly the same time. There is also a version that space cold froze the surface, as if a big space object fell on the surface, pushed out the atmosphere, burned it down, and that space cold rushed into the space. However, this version is not tenable at all. As I mentioned, we cannot discard thermal capacity. Even if space cold hit Earth, it would take years to freeze Earth 1000 meters down. and the atmosphere cannot leave a certain area for ages, and poles of cold are located in really strange places. It makes sense in the southern hemisphere. The light rays are coming from lowest angle and it receives less heat, but in the so-called northern hemisphere there is no logic. It is still 3,000 kilometers from the pole of cold to the North Pole, a place with the lowest angle light rays. And the Arctic is much warmer than Siberia in Oymyakon. These temperatures match the temperature of the Antarctic. These facts are equal. How this place could have such temperatures, and how could Earth freeze down the whole kilometer? The version that a giant nitrogen meteorite fell in this area does not hold. Nitrogen's heat capacity is too low, and again, it takes a lot of time for ground to freeze this deep. Though nitrogen makes up most of the atmosphere, which may mean that this is the remains of the meteorite, then can you imagine the size of the meteorite if it could cover and freeze such an area? It wouldn't only leave the permafrost, but create massive destruction, and it would be noticeable. But the main fact is that it couldn't have frozen the ground almost 1 kilometer deep. It would have to take hundreds of thousands of years. However, gas hydrates that are deep down in permafrost regions, this fact was proven long ago. It is a scientific fact. There are large deposits of gas across Siberia and the Arctic. Take Yamal, for example. How much methane or propane is there? We know that methane hydrates dissolve into gas, water, and that there is great heat absorption. For it to happen, methane hydrate has to be in the zone with lower pressure than under large volumes of water. How could it happen? I have two versions. Pressure on gas hydrates by the Earth crust or by the mass of the Earth could decrease due to decreasing pressure higher in the atmosphere. The reason the pressure decreased is another question. There obviously was some kind of a disaster, and these events are connected. When reaction started and gas hydrates started to emit water and gas with a simultaneous heat absorption, the cold didn't start spreading from the space or somewhere in the atmosphere, but in reverse, from the depths of the Earth. Second version does not contradict the first one. For pressure on gas hydrates to decrease, Earth movement has to occur. If it happened, then certain cavities, cracks, and splits should have appeared too. They could be filled with water and frozen instantly afterwards. This explains why there is permafrost as deep as 1,000 kilometers. Since it is expanding, there is pressure on the walls of the pore, and this is called crystallization pressure. This crystallization pressure can be extremely high. This is why water can break the structure of the rocks, create cracks, increase the size of cavities, pores. Rocks are torn apart when frozen. During cryogenic erosion, it's the main process of destruction of rocks. Since water expands when frozen, the pressure automatically increases and gas bubbles form in enclosed cavities, where we later successfully pump them out. During this catastrophe, there was probably a whole series of events. If Earth moved at such a scale, there was an earthquake. And if there was an earthquake, then there was a flood. Let's not forget that when gas hydrates dissolve, there is not only gas, but water that's also formed. It has to go somewhere, and okay, it can fill all the underground cavities and froze, but we have a great number of groundwaters that could be pushed out and freeze instantly. Just like in the footage where on the shores ice seems to be growing right before our eyes and moves to the shore. Water pushed from inside the earth would not be frozen instantly, but it would happen quite quickly. It would spread with this thick, half-frozen mass across the surface, carrying everything it encountered. Trees and animals trapped into this ice mix would quickly die and freeze for good. Volcanoes were probably active during that time, since this frozen desert was covered with thick layers of ash, dust, that in itself created a sort of surface that was inhabited by moss and lichen. But it's not only volcanoes. When gas erupted to the surface, it broke the ice cap, making funnels. And there's a big number of round lakes scattered across the north and across Siberia. Many of them could have formed this way. When gas exploded close to the surface of the Earth, it spurted great amounts of dust into the atmosphere, which later settled on the frozen Earth. This decrease in temperature was local. From this point of view, the ground should have been reinforced and there should have been no eruptions. But they happen. Many people probably saw this effect in the swamps, when there are rising bubbles. Gas appears in real time and it's blown away instantly. But if there is permafrost and it is 200, 300 meters and somewhere 1200 meters, which is the deepest known to us, in Yakutia there was recently a drill that discovered zero temperature as deep as 1400 meters. And this is with zero temperature. But permafrost temperatures are a bit higher, at 1200 meters. I think that at Novaya Zemlya it's also about 1000 meters. We just don't have this data. Permafrost plays the role of the lid. It stops this gas from being blown away, and it builds up under these layers and can reach rather large volumes. When it cannot shoot up, it doesn't migrate vertically, but it migrates horizontally. Take a note of how permafrost spreads. It looks like an irregular ellipse or a crescent moon. It spreads in the so-called Northern Hemisphere, moving around Iceland, England and Europe, slightly touching its northern part. Note that Iceland is only 400 kilometers away from Greenland, and in Greenland, ice is 300 kilometers thick, and only 400 kilometers away there is Iceland covered in green. Temperatures are suitable for life, there is agriculture, crops are being grown, cattle raised. There is an impression that this territory was not touched on purpose. You see concentrical circles on the map, and if you draw this imaginary line, you'll see that Europe also had to be in the permafrost zone. However, this is where permafrost makes a large detour and passes Greenland, or ancient Hyperborea. It is present in 16th century maps, but later disappears. This is probably what are the most catastrophes connected to. Hyperborea is off the maps today, but I have friends who have been at the northern magnetic pole. There are tours and ships that can take you there. When this continent sinks underwater, and right now there is a funnel 4 kilometers deep in the center of the North Pole. This would probably cause tectonic movement of the plates. Methane hydrates were stored under these plates, so that when the pressure decreased, it started the process of emission of gas and water and the absorption of heat. It caused, if not instant, but really quick freezing. Most of these layers were deep underground, so the most part of it was frozen deep down, at what we call now permafrost, 1 kilometer deep and even more. This is a chain reaction. Imagine an explosion of the Earth's crust, gas coming out, gas being burned, quick freezing deep down, the cold comes up from the deep, with increasing pressure filling up the newly created cavities with water. The part of gas that erupted to the surface with water created something that's similar to nuclear explosions. It's like an explosion of large underground gas storage. And it was not only at one point, but at the point where gas was coming out. It's clear that all this dust flew up, froze, and then settled down, and this formed the layer that moss is currently growing on. This layer is actually earth that used to cover the surface before the disaster, since it was also followed by volcanoes that are nearby in Kamchatka. This dust mixed with volcanic ash and fell down on the frozen earth. This is why we have this thin fertile layer of soil covering the tundra. It is enough to protect permafrost from direct sunlight, saving it for some time. However, the process of heating up the ground is a totally natural process, so sometime we might see a totally different landscape of those lands. We will not discuss the way it might look, just mark it as a fact. It looks like we have dealt with the question of Earth freezing deep down, instantly and at large territory. But what led to this? If something like this happened, it might be to someone's interest. It could be an artificial diversion. If you know the points that you need to hit to cause certain processes, there's always a chance to do this. Hyperborea disappeared along with the most part of the so-called Northern Hemisphere. Permafrost covered enormous territories on the lands that were green so recently. However, Europe and England remained and their climate was not affected. It's still quite pleasant, in fact. Same with Iceland. And Iceland is located directly on the polar circle. Greenland, this small part of it, is lower, and still it's fully covered in ice. Though it is 700 kilometers to the south. It raises some questions, don't you think? I do remember about warm currents, but it goes between Iceland and Greenland, and still on one side there are 3-kilometer tall walls of ice, and on the other there are grazing sheep and flowering tulips. Certainly, there is a great difference between Siberian, Alaskan, Canadian, and Greenland permafrost. This thick layer of ice only covers Greenland, and the same situation is with the Antarctic. Somewhere it's permafrost with no snow at all, with the driest desert in the world, and somewhere there is ice as thick as 4 kilometers. We can clearly draw parallels between these two regions. Temperatures in the Antarctic are 2 times lower than in the Arctic, and are almost equal to temperatures at the pole of cold in Yakutia. But how did those thick ice caps in Greenland and the Antarctic form? And why they are not covered in a layer of soil the same way as the permafrost regions? Maybe they are, but this thick layer of ice covers it. Why Greenland and Antarctica? We still have to solve this question, keeping in mind that this happened quite quickly, between 15th and 17th century. Most probably, it's also connected to the moving rock and to the gas hydrates that was stored closer to the surface, so that they had easier access to the atmosphere, which is really observed by science. Places where permafrost is located not horizontally, spreading across the surface, but like pillars. I had to spend a lot of time watching different lectures and science documentaries to make this video, and I can say that a lot of processes on Earth are still not studied well, and they are still not known very well. Ice can form not only in places with cold and water, as I have shown you, but when it's literally moving forward towards your house. Apparently, it can appear from under the earth, in the middle of the warm and I might say even a hot summer day, and it can be so cold that it can ring.
That is so cool!
You can see that there's a wall that appears in no time. Now imagine that on a grand scale, on the scale of continents. This ice keeps pressing and pressing from the depths and is so strong that large icebergs keep breaking off from Greenland as well as from the Antarctic. They drift away into the ocean where they melt. Warming is unfortunately quite a slow process, so it's unlikely that we will see Greenland covered in green during our lifetime. And the Antarctic will not probably please our eyes with landscapes rich with forests. Of course, we wish ourselves and those close to us good health and longevity, but we have to be realistic. It's not likely that in the nearest 100-150 years it's going to melt to the point where we could plant gardens there. But if it froze this quickly, maybe it could defreeze with the same speed. On this map, we see that the Antarctic ring actually consists of a number of continents or islands, if you please. If you hit them or make a diversion at a certain depth, then this gas hydrates move and all of the continents will be quickly covered by a thick layer of ice. Water and cold, forming in the depths, would push this ice out more and more, eventually falling as icebergs into the ocean. There is an opinion that if the Greenland and the Antarctic melt, then most shorelines and continents will sink underwater. The water levels could rise 100 meters high. But this is not a solid fact. Earth could be regulated in a different way. There are enormous underground reservoirs, and Earth could regulate the amount of water that it needs on the surface itself. So global warming doesn't automatically bring rising sea levels. I think that sea levels always stay the same, and it's the ground that either sinks or rises up. The ice ring of the Antarctic plays a role of a floodgate between the inner and the outer oceans. These technologies are used by people, for example when building tunnels and freezing the walls of the tunnel or the ground around it to stop water from flowing in. So the true purpose and reason behind this layer of ice is not what the science suggests. Today it's the boundary of the world, the edge of the earth, that holds an answer to what's behind it. Our common project will help figure this out. Not to miss anything out, subscribe, press the bell, comment, and when you go to sleep, put on a playlist and turn on autoplay. You haven't even risen from bed, but you already did a good deed. And if you could save €1 a month and transfer it to the project, you can consider this month worth living. I wish you strong health, take care of yourself and your close ones, be happy, and we'll see you again soon.
Мы держим путь на край земли.